The freezing red wine dripped down my silk collar before hundreds of staring Miami elites. Morgan Vance, the biotech heiress needing my $2.4 billion approval, smirked like I was a rat among swans. She never realized the phone in my pocket kept her empire alive. 30 seconds later, I pressed one button. No slapping, no screaming. I simply erased her future, and that was merely the beginning of her self-inflicted nightmare. Hello and welcome back to the loyal listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. We are truly grateful for your continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, entirely cutting off our operating budget, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and will transition our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel to hear exclusive true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and detail situations we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all fully produced with a cast of deeply emotional voice actors. You can join our community by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or the pinned comment below. Now, let us dive directly into the cold reality of today's story, experienced through the eyes of our protagonist, Alyssa Scott. The air conditioning inside the grand ballroom of the Miami Plaza Hotel was fighting a losing battle against the stifling Florida heat outside. But inside the hall, the atmosphere was freezing, calculated, and dripping with opulent wealth. Tonight was the absolute apex of the corporate social season, a lavish charity gala functioning merely as a thinly veiled stage for Ethelgard Biosciences. In exactly 1 hour, they were scheduled to announce a monumental capital injection of $2.4 billion. The massive crystal chandeliers refracted harsh light off diamond necklaces and champagne flutes, creating a dizzying, blinding constellation of synthetic stars. I stood near the quietest edge of the mahogany bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water. At 38 years old, operating as the Chief Compliance and Due Diligence Officer of Vanguard Apex Capital, a shadow investment fund that moved global markets without ever making a headline. My job was to see absolutely everything while remaining entirely unseen. I had just stepped off a 14-hour international flight. My bones ached with a deep, heavy exhaustion. Unlike the glittering peacocks swarming the room in custom couture, I wore a simple, unbranded black silk blouse and tailored trousers. I preferred strict minimalism. It made me invisible. Tonight, I was merely observing the Ethelgard executives in their natural habitat before I signed my name on the final wire transfer that would secure their legacy. Across the room, holding court near the velvet ropes of the VIP section, was Morgan Vance. The 24-year-old heiress to the Ethelgard empire was heavily intoxicated, though not necessarily from the expensive alcohol. She was drunk on the sheer, unadulterated power her father's upcoming deal promised. She was surrounded by a flock of desperate, younger tech investors, throwing their heads back at every painfully unfunny joke she made. Morgan thrived on this attention. She fed on the hierarchy, desperate to prove she was the apex predator in a room full of wolves. Through the reflection of the mirrored bar back, I saw her gaze land squarely on me. I was standing slightly too close to her sacred VIP boundary. My plain black clothes and lack of recognizable designer logos must have deeply offended her highly curated aesthetic. She whispered something to a sycophant beside her, a cruel, predatory smirk, twisting her perfectly painted lips, and began marching directly toward me. The crowded room naturally parted for her, eager to witness the incoming slaughter. "Excuse me." Morgan's voice cut through the ambient jazz, pitched loud enough to ensure the surrounding circle of elites could hear every syllable. "Are you lost? The staff entrance is through the kitchen, sweetheart." I did not shift my posture. I merely turned my head, meeting her gaze calmly. I remained utterly silent, analyzing her dilated pupils and the slight tremor of pure adrenaline in her manicured hands. My silence infuriated her. It denied her the pathetic submission she so desperately craved. "I am talking to you," she snapped, stepping aggressively into my personal space, the scent of her overwhelmingly sweet, $5,000 perfume assaulted my senses, masking the smell of liquor on her breath. People like you should not be breathing the same air as the people funding this city. Do not stand in the way of the people shaping the world. You piece of trash. Before I could even blink, her hand flicked forward. It was not a stumble. It was not a drunken accident. With a deliberate, violent twist of her wrist, she hurled the entire contents of her oversized crystal goblet directly at my chest. The vintage red wine hit me with the force of a physical blow. The liquid was freezing cold against my flushed skin, instantly soaking through the thin silk of my blouse, clinging to my collarbone, and dripping down my ribcage in heavy, dark, crimson streaks. The rich, earthy smell of fermented grapes instantly overpowered the room's expensive floral arrangements. The coldness seeped into my bones, a stark physical reminder of the humiliation she was attempting to inflict upon me. The ambient chatter of 1,000 wealthy elites died instantly. The jazz quartet on the main stage faltered, a saxophone screeching to a painful, jagged halt. A deafening, suffocating silence slammed down over the grand ballroom. The only sound was the steady drip of wine falling from my hem onto the polished floor. Then came the frantic, mechanical clicking. Camera flashes from the society photographers erupted like a violent lightning storm, blinding me as they desperately captured the glamorous heiress and her humiliated, nameless victim. The crowd held its collective breath. They were waiting. They wanted blood. They fully expected me to burst into pathetic tears, to scream desperate obscenities, or to run away hiding my face in ultimate shame. I did none of those things. The freezing wetness of the wine on my skin only sharpened my absolute focus. I reached over to the bar, my movements painfully slow and deliberate. I took a single, thick white cocktail napkin. I pressed it gently against my collar, absorbing the darkest pool of the red stain. I lowered my hand and looked directly into Morgan Vance's eyes. I offered no anger. I offered no sorrow. I gave her an empty, hollow, terrifyingly dead stare. It was the exact look a butcher gives a slab of meat right before the blade drops. I watched the briefest flicker of genuine confusion, perhaps even primal fear, cross her arrogant face. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, without uttering a single syllable. I dropped the blood-red stained napkin onto the mahogany bar. I turned my back to her and walked out the grand double doors of the ballroom, my footsteps echoing with perfect rhythm against the marble floor, leaving behind the shrill, forced laughter of a little girl who had just unknowingly signed the death warrant of her entire family dynasty. The heavy revolving glass doors of the hotel pushed me out into the suffocating, humid embrace of the Miami night. The dense, salty air clung to my damp skin, but the oppressive weather was completely irrelevant to me now. My physical comfort meant nothing. I reached deep into the hidden compartment of my handbag and bypassed my regular smartphone. Instead, my fingers wrapped securely around the cold, heavy titanium casing of my encrypted satellite device. This was the specific hardware reserved exclusively for catastrophic market shifts and absolute financial warfare. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the biometric scanner. A tiny green indicator light confirmed my identity. I bypassed all standard communication protocols and opened a secure, untraceable line directly to our London headquarters. The line rang exactly twice. "Marcus," I stated, my tone entirely stripping away any room for standard corporate pleasantries. "Marcus Thorne, the chief advisor and lead tactical strategist of Vanguard Apex Capital," answered with sharp, immediate attention. He knew I never utilized this specific line unless the ground was completely collapsing beneath our feet. Before he could even inquire about the gala's atmosphere, I delivered the execution order with surgical precision. "Activate the Omega Protocol. Freeze all capital flows, immediately." A profound, incredibly tense silence radiated through the encrypted connection. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried the calculated friction of a man actively staring down the barrel of a global financial apocalypse. "Alyssa, you need to verify this directive. We are exactly 45 minutes away from the public signing ceremony. If we pull a $2.4 billion capital injection at the 11th hour, we will trigger an unprecedented media earthquake. The Securities and Exchange Commission will swarm our offices by dawn. Richard Vance will undoubtedly unleash a wave of catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against us for sudden breach of contract. I walked gracefully toward the curb where my waiting armored black vehicle idled quietly in the shadows. "Let him try," I replied, the absolute zero chill in my voice, freezing the damp air around me. They have absolutely no legal standing to sue when the moral compass of their designated heir is a toxic, volatile garbage dump. Kill the wire, Marcus. Burn the bridge, now. I severed the connection. The heavy titanium device went completely dark in the palm of my hand. Inside the grand ballroom, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine accelerating toward his neck, Chief Executive Officer Richard Vance was actively basking in the manufactured glory of his crowning achievement. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the hotel facade, I maintained a perfect, cinematic view of the impending slaughter. Vance confidently strode up to the crystal podium, adjusting his tailored silk tie with a sickeningly smug grin. Behind him, a colossal, custom-built LED screen dominated the main stage, displaying a highly rendered animated golden vault and a massive countdown clock ticking down to 0. He raised both hands, playing the practiced role of the benevolent corporate visionary, effectively silencing the murmuring crowd of wealthy elites. He was delivering his triumphant keynote speech, practically shouting into the microphone about the revolutionary future of Ethelgard Biosciences. With a dramatic, sweeping theatrical gesture, he raised his right index finger, preparing to aggressively press the ceremonial digital button on his podium console. That single press was meant to trigger the final public confirmation of our massive capital transfer. He slammed his finger down hard on the glass. He fully expected a shower of digital confetti, soaring stock market projections, and a roaring standing ovation. Instead, the Vanguard internal security system fought back with brutal, automated efficiency. The animated golden vault on the massive screen violently glitched. The warm, inviting corporate graphics rapidly shattered into jagged, corrupted digital pixels. In less than a fraction of a second, the entire 50-foot digital display bled into a harsh, blinding, aggressive crimson red. Bold, glaring white letters violently materialized across the bloody red background, towering ominously over the stage. Transaction suspended, breach of fiduciary duty. The visual impact was immediate, devastating, and absolute. The harsh red glow washed over the horrified, pale faces of the elite crowd. Total, unadulterated chaos erupted within mere milliseconds. Richard Vance stood entirely paralyzed at the podium, a pathetic statue carved from pure panic. His triumphant smile morphed into a twisted mask of sheer terror. He frantically tapped the digital console, his hands shaking violently, but the red screen of death remained stubbornly unyielding. Then, the true nightmare set in. It started as a low, ominous hum, then rapidly escalated into a deafening, synchronized cacophony of digital alarms. The personal cell phones of over 500 elite investors, hedge fund managers, and banking executives began vibrating and ringing simultaneously. Breaking news alerts from major financial networks were already hitting the wire. Automated trading algorithms were flashing urgent warning signs across countless screens. The sophisticated ballroom instantly descended into an absolute frenzy. Executives shouted terrified profanities. Heavy crystal champagne glasses shattered entirely unnoticed on the polished marble floor, and panicked reporters scrambled aggressively toward the emergency exits to call their news desks. I sat comfortably in the deep, quiet leather seat of my vehicle, parked safely directly across the street. I watched the frantic, flashing red lights reflecting violently off the hotel's pristine glass exterior. The frantic shadows of billionaires running aimlessly looked exactly like terrified ants, fleeing a burning, collapsing hive. I rolled up the thick-tinted window, permanently severing my visual connection to their chaotic demise. I leaned forward, tapping the glass partition separating me from my driver. "Take me to the private airstrip," I instructed with total, unshakable calm. "We are done here." At exactly 9:30 the following morning, The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange echoed like a violent funeral toll for Ethelgard Biosciences. Within the first 12 minutes of frantic trading, their corporate stock price plummeted a staggering 22%. Panic swept through the trading floors like a virulent plague. Financial news anchors on every major broadcasting network were actively scrambling, their voices laced with genuine, unscripted anxiety as they desperately tried to decipher the impossible. Why would Vanguard Apex Capital abruptly pull a massive, life-saving capital injection of $2.4 billion mere seconds before the ink could permanently dry? The global market inherently abhors a vacuum, but it is utterly terrified of a silent, unexplained withdrawal by a notoriously ruthless shadow fund. By 10:15, the complex financial mystery collided violently with the vicious world of social media gossip. A shaky, yet incredibly high-definition smartphone video, recorded by a society photographer at the charity gala, was leaked directly to a notorious corporate investigative blog. The footage was brutally clear. It showed Morgan Vance, her face twisted in cruel, unadulterated arrogance, viciously hurling her red wine onto a seemingly nameless woman dressed in a simple black silk blouse. Inside the luxurious penthouse boardroom of Ethelgard headquarters, Richard Vance was pacing like a caged animal, screaming uncontrollably at his elite crisis management team. He demanded to know the exact identity of the woman his daughter had so publicly humiliated. When his chief of corporate intelligence finally walked into the room, his hands visibly shaking, he placed a single printed dossier onto the glass table, the color completely drained from Richard Vance's face. He felt his lungs collapse. He was staring at a high-resolution photograph of me, Alyssa Scott, the apex predator of Vanguard, the singular, unforgiving gatekeeper who held the absolute, unilateral authority to either approve or permanently terminate his life-saving capital injection. Instead of immediately offering a groveling, desperate apology to save her family's legacy, Morgan doubled down on her toxic delusion. She vehemently refused to accept even a fraction of the blame for the collapsing stock price. Operating purely on spoiled, defensive instinct, she secretly wired $500,000 to a shadow public relations firm specializing in ruthless character assassination. By noon, highly coordinated automated bot networks were flooding social media platforms with a completely fabricated, malicious narrative. They spun a hysterical, venomous tale claiming I was a deeply unstable, jealous, middle-aged corporate drone. They aggressively pushed the lie that I had maliciously staged the entire altercation because I secretly despised Morgan's youth, beauty, and glamorous lifestyle. They desperately tried to paint the termination of the multi-billion-dollar deal as the erratic, emotional tantrum of a bitter woman. Her desperate, dirty tactics unfortunately succeeded in creating a massive secondary shockwave. The intensely private, highly conservative board of directors at Vanguard absolutely despised public scandal. My heavily encrypted desktop phone rang relentlessly. The senior partners demanded an immediate, secure video conference. They were visibly sweating over the potential collateral damage to our fund's historically flawless reputation. Alyssa, you need to neutralize this disaster immediately, the board chairman pleaded, his voice incredibly tight with mounting anxiety. The public optics are rapidly turning toxic. Accept a quiet and confidential financial settlement, force a very public, tearful apology from the Vance girl, and let us push the original deal through before our own limited partners start asking extremely dangerous questions. I stared blankly at the glowing grid of wealthy, frightened old men on my massive computer monitor. There will be absolutely no settlement, I stated with a chilling, absolute finality. I was not operating out of a bruised ego or a petty desire for personal revenge. I saw a terrifying, fundamental truth that they were entirely missing in their panic. An air as recklessly volatile, intensely arrogant, and easily provoked as Morgan Vance had absolutely no business overseeing a global biotechnology firm responsible for millions of human lives. If a perceived, minor slight at a cocktail party made her lash out violently and destructively, what would she do when a critical clinical trial failed? I firmly terminated the board call and locked my heavy office door. I needed to crush Morgan's pathetic public relations offensive with absolute, undeniable facts. I instructed my internal corporate intelligence division to execute a deep, aggressive, and highly secretive sweep of all data linked to Morgan's recent communications. I was merely looking for standard leverage to permanently break her smear campaign. What I found instead was a ghost hidden in the machine. While meticulously cross-referencing Morgan's carefully curated press releases against Ethelgard's heavily redacted regulatory medical filings, I noticed a microscopic anomaly. It was a brilliantly concealed data gap buried incredibly deep within their Phase 3 clinical trial reports. Someone had meticulously scrubbed all references to a specific set of severe adverse patient reactions occurring exactly 3 months prior. The timing of this massive data deletion lined up perfectly with Morgan's sudden, hyper-aggressive push to secure our $2.4 billion funding at absolutely any cost. The complex pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a terrifying picture. The arrogant, drunken display of dominance at the gala was not just the typical behavior of a spoiled billionaire's daughter, it was the desperate, reckless flailing of a cornered, terrified animal. Morgan Vance was desperately hiding a catastrophic, lethal failure under a fragile, glittering mask of extreme superiority. Her horrific behavior was not just ego, it was a massive, flashing neon sign of absolute, unfiltered panic. The physical security infrastructure at Vanguard Apex Capital headquarters was specifically designed to be deeply intimidating. It was a sterile, imposing fortress constructed entirely of brushed titanium and thick bulletproof glass, deliberately devoid of the welcoming warmth that was standard in most corporate American environments. When Richard Vance and his daughter arrived unannounced at my building, desperately bypassing all standard communication channels to physically beg for an audience, they fully expected immediate VIP treatment. My executive assistant quietly informed me of their chaotic arrival in the ground floor lobby. I did not decline the meeting. Instead, I executed a very simple psychological tactic. I instructed the heavily armed security detail to entirely strip them of all their electronic devices, their smartwatches, and their phones, citing strict corporate espionage protocols. Then, I had them placed in the stark, perfectly white containment lobby, and I let them sit there. I made them wait for exactly 3 agonizing hours. I wanted the suffocating, unbroken silence and the absolute lack of digital stimulation to completely erode their manufactured confidence. By the time my security detail finally escorted them up the private elevator to my top-floor executive suite, the polished, arrogant veneer of the billionaire chief executive officer and the glamorous heiress had severely and visibly cracked. They cautiously stepped into my massive office, a vast expanse of dark mahogany paneling and panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling concrete canyons of the financial district. I deliberately did not stand up to greet them. I offered no handshake. I simply gestured with an open palm toward the 2 low, intentionally uncomfortable leather chairs positioned directly across from my massive, imposing desk. Richard Vance looked visibly aged. The deep, heavy lines of immense stress were etched firmly into his pale face. Morgan looked remarkably subdued, dressed in a conservative, neutral beige suit that violently contradicted her usual flashy, highly branded aesthetic. Richard immediately attempted to seize control of the shifting narrative. He leaned heavily forward, placing both hands flat on the polished mahogany surface of my desk, attempting a pathetic display of humble sincerity. "Alyssa, please," Richard began, his voice dripping with a highly calculated, greasy desperation. "We are here today to make this right. The market reaction this morning has been utterly catastrophic for everyone involved. I am fully prepared to personally transfer 15% of my private founder shares directly to Vanguard Apex Capital, entirely off the official regulatory books. In addition to this massive financial concession, Morgan is fully prepared to issue a complete, unreserved public apology across all major global media networks. We can easily frame the unfortunate incident at the gala as a tragic, exhausting misunderstanding. You get total control, and we save the company. Just release the capital." Right on cue, Morgan aggressively activated her rehearsed performance. Her heavily mascaraed eyes brimmed with perfectly timed tears. Her lower lip trembled violently as she looked directly at me, clutching her trembling hands together tightly in her lap. "I am so incredibly sorry," Morgan whispered, her voice cracking with an award-winning display of manufactured grief. I was under a massive amount of intense, unmanageable stress that night. The crushing pressure of the upcoming merger completely broke me, and I lashed out in the most horrific, unforgivable way imaginable. "Please, I am begging you, do not punish my father and the thousands of hardworking employees at our company for my inexcusable personal mistake. I am begging for your ultimate forgiveness." It was a masterful, highly trained theatrical display. The tears rolling down her cheeks were entirely real, but they were tears of intense self-pity, not actual remorse. If you looked closely, straight past the wet, fluttering eyelashes and the trembling chin, the underlying truth was blindingly obvious. Her dark eyes were entirely hard, razor sharp, and burning with a toxic, volatile mixture of intense resentment and deep, primal contempt. She absolutely hated me for violently forcing her into this humiliating, submissive posture. I let her tragic, desperate silence hang in the freezing, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of my office for a long, unbearable minute. Then, I slowly reached into my locked bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy black folder. I dropped it flat onto the glass surface of my desk with a loud, aggressive thud that made Morgan visibly jump. "Save the pathetic, crying performance for the daytime reality television networks," I stated, my voice entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Your apology is completely worthless to me. I do not care about your fabricated emotional stress, and I certainly do not care about your deeply damaged ego." Richard stiffened immediately, the false, groveling humility instantly vanishing from his rigid posture. "Then what exactly do you want?" he demanded sharply, his tone growing defensive. I flipped open the heavy black folder, revealing stacks of highlighted data tables. "I want to talk about the missing mortality data from your Phase 3 clinical trials. Richard, the specific set of data that magically disappeared from your federal regulatory filings exactly 3 months ago. The exact same highly encrypted data I easily recovered from your internal servers late last night." I watched the remaining color completely drain from both of their faces. The heavy silence in the room instantly shifted from uncomfortable to incredibly dense, actively suffocating them. "You were desperately rushing this $2.4 billion merger," I continued smoothly, sliding a highly classified, heavily highlighted medical report across the desk directly toward his shaking hands. "Not to expand your revolutionary biomedical research facilities, but to frantically cover up a massive, lethal failure. Your flagship medical prototype is deeply, fundamentally flawed. You desperately needed our capital to quietly bury the failing research, secretly pay off the government regulators, and artificially inflate your collapsing stock price before the entire fraudulent house of cards violently collapsed onto your head." The desperate, pleading father instantly vanished from the room. Richard Vance abruptly stood up, kicking his heavy leather chair back aggressively. His face twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated corporate rage. The thin mask of high society civility was permanently shattered. "You are walking onto incredibly dangerous ground, little girl," Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a menacing, guttural, aggressive threat. "Do you have any actual idea who I play golf with every single weekend? I have 3 sitting federal senators firmly in my back pocket who rely heavily on my dark money campaign contributions. I have the entire Health Regulatory Committee on my personal, untraceable payroll. If you attempt to permanently block this fund or leak those fabricated, stolen documents to the press, I will unleash a massive political firestorm that will completely choke Vanguard Apex to death. I will have heavily armed federal regulators auditing your shadow fund every single day for the next 10 solid years. You will never, ever work in this global industry again." His loud, aggressive threats echoed pointlessly against the thick, soundproof glass walls of my office. He was a desperate, drowning man violently swinging a broken, useless sword at the ocean. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or break my calm posture. I simply offered him a very slight, terrifyingly calm, dead-eyed smile. I casually opened my top desk drawer one final time. I slowly pulled out the crumpled white cocktail napkin from the charity gala. The large, dark red stain of the vintage wine had completely dried into a rigid, ugly, blood-like crust over the fabric. I casually tossed the stained napkin across the polished mahogany desk. It landed softly, perfectly positioned right next to his trembling, sweaty hands. "You raised a ticking time bomb," I said, my voice barely above a quiet whisper, yet carrying the absolute crushing weight of an executioner's final, undeniable decree. "And now, it just detonated on your own estate. Get out of my office." Richard Vance was a man of his dangerous word. Less than 24 hours after he aggressively stormed out of my office, the massive political machinery he secretly funded sprang into violent action. The morning financial networks were completely dominated by a sudden coordinated leak, claiming federal regulatory agencies were launching a sweeping, invasive probe into Vanguard Apex Capital over alleged shadow investments and illegal market manipulation. The orchestrated media assault was devastatingly effective. By noon, my internal phone lines were melting down. The deeply conservative board of directors convened a frantic emergency session, actively drafting a resolution to formally strip me of my executive authority and violently push me out of the firm to save their own lucrative skins. Simultaneously, Morgan Vance took her manufactured tragedy to the national stage. During a highly promoted, primetime television interview, she expertly played the ultimate victim, dressed in soft, innocent pastel colors. She wept elegantly on high-definition cameras, publicly claiming her family's noble crusade to cure rare human diseases was being viciously bullied and systematically dismantled by predatory, soulless capitalist vultures. The general public, always eager to aggressively hate a faceless hedge fund, swallowed the tearful narrative completely, driven by a massive wave of misplaced public sympathy and aggressive retail buying. Ethelgard stock began a slow, stubborn climb out of the absolute gutter. Marcus Thorne bypassed my secretary and walked directly into my office, shutting the heavy mahogany door firmly behind him. He looked utterly exhausted, the weight of the massive corporate crisis pressing heavily on his shoulders. "You have to let this go, Alyssa," Marcus warned, his voice tight with genuine, absolute concern. "The board of directors is preparing the guillotine as we speak. If you do not officially resign by tomorrow morning and sign off on a quiet settlement to release the funds, they will publicly crucify you to appease the federal regulators. You are playing a completely losing hand against extreme political power. Fold your cards right now and walk away with your career intact." I kept my eyes firmly locked on the concrete city below my window. "I am not playing cards. Marcus, I am operating a controlled demolition. Give me until midnight." I absolutely refused to yield a single inch of ground. The moment Marcus left the room, I activated a highly specialized, deeply covert asset. I authorized an aggressive digital siege, utilizing an elite team of white hat hacker operatives based out of a highly secure server farm. I instructed them not to attack Ethelgard directly, as that would immediately trigger their primary security alarms. Instead, they ruthlessly exploited a critical data vulnerability within a third-party medical supply vendor affiliated with the Vance Empire, slipping entirely unnoticed through the digital backdoor into the absolute deepest, most heavily encrypted architecture of Ethelgard's internal mainframe. I sat alone in my dark office for 6 agonizing hours, watching complex strings of raw, decrypted data flood my private monitors, and then, at exactly 11:45 at night, the final encrypted corporate vault violently cracked open, pouring out the absolute, horrifying truth. It was not merely a failed clinical trial or a simple statistical anomaly like I had previously suspected. The revolutionary biomedical technology Ethelgard was aggressively selling to the entire world was a complete, deliberate, century-defining fraud. The heavily guarded internal video files and raw laboratory readouts clearly showed their flagship medical prototype had caused gruesome, immediate, and catastrophic organ failure in 100% of their animal test subjects. There was absolutely no cure. There was no medical breakthrough. It was a lethal, totally fabricated pipe dream. The Vance family desperately needed our $2.4 billion not to fund visionary research, but to instantly plug a massive, catastrophic financial deficit caused by years of systematically covering up the dead animals, falsifying federal safety data, and heavily bribing government health inspectors to permanently look the other way. But the most chilling piece of the entire puzzle was a heavily redacted security log from the night of the Miami Gala. I carefully cross-referenced the exact timeline, and suddenly, the violent wine incident crystallized with terrifying, absolute clarity. Morgan Vance did not throw that freezing red wine on me simply because I was wearing an unbranded blouse or standing too close to her VIP section. That was a convenient, arrogant cover story. I sharply rewound my own memory of that night. Seconds before Morgan aggressively approached me, I had been casually speaking to a nervous, older man standing quietly near the bar. I had assumed he was just another wealthy, eccentric donor. The stolen, highly classified employee logs revealed his true identity. He was Dr. Alias Mercer, the recently terminated lead biological researcher for Ethelgard. Morgan had spotted him, talking to the exact woman holding the absolute keys to her family's salvation. Terrified that the fired, disgruntled researcher was actively exposing the massive, lethal fraud to me right there in the crowded ballroom, she completely panicked. She aggressively marched over and orchestrated a massive, humiliating public spectacle, violently throwing the wine to permanently sever our conversation and violently force me to leave the venue before Dr. Mercer could utter another damaging word. Her supreme, untouchable arrogance was nothing more than a desperate, chaotic shield used to protect a multi-billion-dollar criminal conspiracy. She mistakenly thought a single glass of wine would wash away the ultimate threat. Instead, she had permanently painted a giant, glowing target directly on her own back. I compiled every single page of the stolen evidence, locked it securely onto an encrypted flash drive, and calmly prepared to burn their entirely false empire straight to the ground. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, the heavy oak doors of the Vanguard Apex Capital Executive Boardroom were sealed completely shut. The emergency tribunal was fully assembled. 12 senior partners, men who controlled trillions of dollars globally, sat rigidly around the massive conference table. Dominating the far wall was a massive high-definition video monitor, beamed in live from their sunlit Miami penthouse office. Richard and Morgan Vance sat shoulder to shoulder, practically glowing with manufactured triumph. This was meant to be a corporate execution, and I was the designated casualty. The chairman of the board, a ruthless octogenarian who deeply despised public volatility, cleared his throat to deliver the final verdict. Alyssa, in light of the severe political pressure and the unprecedented disruption to the Ethelgard merger, this board has voted unanimously, effective immediately. Your executive authority is permanently revoked. We are initiating a total reversal of your freeze order and authorizing the immediate release of the $2.4 billion transfer. I did not sit down. I walked calmly to the absolute center of the long table. From my leather briefcase, I extracted a heavy, 500-page bound manuscript. It was a physical manifestation of absolute destruction. I raised it high and slammed it heavily onto the polished mahogany with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. "Before you sign that authorization," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension like cold steel, "you might want to read exactly what you are purchasing." The chairman frowned deeply, reaching for the massive stack of paper, but before his fingers could even graze the cover page, a violent commotion erupted from the live video feed. On the massive screen, Richard Vance leaned forward, his smug smile instantly faltering as loud, aggressive shouting echoed from outside his Miami office. Morgan turned her head sharply, her perfectly styled hair whipping across her face. Then, the heavy oak doors of the Ethelgard executive suite were violently kicked completely off their hinges. A swarm of heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark tactical gear emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission flooded the penthouse. Absolute chaos instantly consumed the video feed. "Federal warrant!" a senior agent roared, his voice booming through our boardroom speakers. "Richard Vance, Morgan Vance, you are both under arrest for massive securities fraud, wire fraud, and severe criminal conspiracy." The absolute horror that violently twisted Morgan's face was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The arrogant, untouchable heiress was instantly reduced to a screaming, terrified child. She wildly thrashed against the heavy desk, frantically shrieking for her elite corporate lawyers, completely losing all composure as the cold steel of heavy handcuffs clamped brutally around her slender wrists. Richard Vance was forcefully slammed face first onto his own mahogany desk, his desperate political threats completely silenced by the crushing, undeniable weight of federal authority. The highly anticipated $2.4 billion merger instantly evaporated into toxic ashes, their entire fraudulent empire permanently locked down in a matter of seconds. The live video feed abruptly cut to static black. The Vanguard boardroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence. The 12 senior partners, men who had been mere seconds away from wiring billions of dollars directly into a massive national criminal conspiracy, stared at the blank screen, completely paralyzed. Slowly, they turned their pale, terrified faces toward me. They finally understood. My sudden, brutal cancellation of the wire transfer had absolutely nothing to do with a spilled glass of red wine or a bruised ego. I had single-handedly saved Vanguard Apex Capital from becoming the primary financial accomplice in the most devastating biomedical fraud scheme of the entire century. Exactly 1 month later, the frantic media circus had finally moved on to the next corporate slaughter. I sat comfortably in the absolute silence of my corner office. Marcus Thorne quietly opened the door, holding a thick legal brief in his hand. He placed it gently on my desk. "The federal grand jury just returned the indictments," Marcus reported, a tone of absolute reverence in his voice. "Ethelgard Biosciences has officially filed for total bankruptcy liquidation, and Morgan Vance was just denied bail. She is actively facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." I simply nodded, quietly thanking him before he respectfully backed out of the room. I opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick plastic evidence bag containing my ruined black silk blouse. The dark, crusty red stain of the vintage wine was a permanent, ugly reminder of that humid night in Miami. But as I held the ruined garment, I felt absolutely no anger. True, pure revenge is never about making your enemies taste temporary, fleeting pain. It is about systematically, permanently stripping away the artificial pedestal of power that allowed their toxic arrogance to flourish in the first place. You do not have to scream to completely destroy an empire. The absolute ultimate power in this world always hides deep within the chilling, unbroken silence of the people they foolishly believe to be completely invisible. I casually dropped the stained silk blouse directly into the trash bin beneath my desk, permanently erasing the Vance family from my existence. Thank you all so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We truly appreciate every single one of you. Please let us know down in the comments where in the world you are listening from today. As a gentle reminder, since YouTube has demonetized our content and we will no longer upload new videos here in the near future, we are completely transitioning our operations over to Patreon. If you found today's story thrilling and want to support the channel, please help us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear the absolute best, highly detailed, and exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen or by clicking the direct Patreon link located in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you once again for your incredible support, and we look forward to seeing you over there.